and that we could use more bipartisanship. One way to do that might be to, say, run for president of the United States. So I know that's idea for someone named Kennedy, in New Hampshire. But do you have any thoughts on that? Have you been thinking about it?
I'm thinking about it. I passed the biggest hurdle, which is life is green light. If things go great, we're going to have the funniest first lady in history. We all need a lot of laughs.
Hi, and welcome to WPYP Presents Ward 13 with John Hopwood. And I am John Hopwood, and looking a little like, I can say Glenn Arjulette on my show. They're just not allowed to mention Glenn's name on public radio. And I think I'm going to be doing a salute to Glenn RJ in maybe 3 or 4 weeks' time. And, we'll put on a real song fest. I'll get a bouquet, and maybe I can get a 17-year-old girl here. Well, girl here. Is that a correct term to use these days? Christ only knows, huh? Hey, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was in Goffstown, right on the border of Manchester, this past Friday at the St. Anselm's at the Institute of Politics, which is, that used to be the National Guard Armory, and I used to play there because my parents' house was 1 block away, maybe a block and 1 house away. That's where I used to come for Yahoo, and I covered the 2004-2008 primaries. I'd go visit my mother, and you just walk up there. No parking hassles. Now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the son of my childhood hero, who was Bobby Kennedy. Now, when I was in the 3rd grade, I used to tell every Wednesday the progress of the primaries after the New Hampshire primary, where Eugene McCarthy knocked out LBJ, a sitting president, by coming in a very strong second in the 68 primary. Bobby Kennedy was not on the ballot then, and I think he threw his hat into the ring about a week or 2 weeks later. And then LBJ, he was through. And we all know what happened to Bobby. I used to tell my grade class about, there weren't as many primaries then. I think there were only 13. But I'd say what happened. I'd wait up, watch the news. My mother would let me stay up. These were much more restrictive times, folks. I'm sure you people, baby boomers, you sexagenarians like myself remember that. And where you didn't get up to stay watching TV all night long as a tot, or whatever you call a kid of 8 years old. Of course, then there was the California primary. And I remember seeing the news, and then my mother turned the TV off. And so I did not see the assassination, although the next morning, everyone, of course, knew about it. But it was so, my fondness of Robert Kennedy was so intense that I insisted to my third grade teacher that he had written Profiles in Courage. And they explained to me that no, his brother, John F. Kennedy, who I remember, of course, I was 4 years old. I just turned 4 when he was assassinated, about a month after my birthday, almost exactly. And they said, no, Bobby Kennedy Robert's written the introduction, but he was such my hero that I insisted that he did. And it's interesting about Profiles in Courage because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is one of the most disparaged human beings in America because he is perceived as an anti-vaxxer. Now, we're finding out from Musk revealing the inner workings of Twitter that there was some type of semi-official agency that rated personalities for being on the internet in order to ban them, in order to censor them. And Tony Fauci, who Robert F. Kennedy Jr. called a liar last Friday, and who is a liar. I remember him lying about AIDS a generation ago. He was number 10, on the scale of 10, positive. And at the bottom was Elon Musk. Then I think number 9 was Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr., and then Jordan Peterson, the controversial psychologist from Canada. But I have about 40 minutes of clips, and I'm going to have a second show next week. Let's roll the first video, please.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a champion of the New Hampshire presidential primary. And the reason is... Our primary is really about democracy, and it's not just good for New Hampshire and the Democrats here. It's good for America that candidates get tested, they get the questions, and they get the follow-up questions. That is good for us. And so we are very pleased about the fact that he came here today. He was here in 1980 working for his uncle and got a lot of experience here in New Hampshire. One final thing, and the most important thing, we'll make decisions in our life, and we know that our speaker here made a great decision. His wife Cheryl Hines is here today as well. You might recognize her. We're very happy to have you here. Without further ado, our speaker, Robert F. Kennedy.
Thank you to Neil Levesque. I apologize for my voice, which should actually sound a little better as I speak. And I want to thank St. Anselm College for having me here. Ray Buckley, who is the only one in this room who's funnier than my wife. And Steve Shirtliff, thank you very much for your a wonderful discussion we had about the history of the primary and my family's involvement. I was told by Steve something I didn't know about my family, and I'm kind of a family historian, so it's rare that I find out something new, but that my father, or my grandfather, Joseph Kennedy, funded, really created a Democratic primary in its modern form in this state in 1959 in preparation for my uncle's run, and that was a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing it with me. Lissandro, I don't think is here, but who I saw outside, and that was a thrill. And then Donna Susie, thank you all for being great Democrats, and thanks for everything that you've done, devoted your lives to the idealism of making this country live up to its highest ideals and making our democracy work for all Americans. I wrote a letter to the DNC because I was just dumbly shocked by the optics of what was happening at this particular time in history, when we had probably the greatest polarization in our country that we've ever had since the Civil War. A really dangerous polarization, and we don't know which direction it's going to go in, but it ought to be a preoccupation of anybody who wants to lead this country. How do you bridge the gap, this growing gap between Americans? It's very, very tribalistic gap. And the fulcrum of that conversation for the past 2 years has been on election integrity. You know, whether it's January 6th, but for the past 2 elections, 2016 and 2021, there are people in both parties who do not believe the results, for better or for worse, right or wrong. In 2001, every Democrat believed we had elections stolen in our country. In 2004, I wrote an award-winning article for Rolling Stone about the theft of the 2004 election. So people have concerns about election integrity, and a larger concern that everything is being rigged. You know, that if you're a big shot, you can rig anything. And that if you're a little guy or a little girl, little woman, you don't have any say in what happens. And here we have the president of our party, president of the United States, and head of our party who feels like he needs to move this primary to a state where he can better control the outcome. And what does that say to people who really believe that they're alienating this country? As Neil pointed out, this state has played a critical role in choosing candidates. In every other state, you can have these kind of aerial bombardments by billionaires or by the party where they don't have to meet anybody, where they can just propagandize them and buy advertising or whatever, or do very big events. And this state vets candidates for the entire country. They have to come into this state and run like they're running for a school board or for a town hall, and they get the questions, and they'll go into a hair salon or a diner in Plymouth or Keene or Nashua, and they'll have to face an 80-year-old woman who reads The Economist every week, and drilling down on these kind of questions that they're not going to get from the New York Times, they're not going to get from CNN, and they have to do the follow-up questions. And it's a service in New Hampshire, and the open-mindedness of the people in this state, where they genuinely do not make up their mind to the end. And they approach it's a service that this state serves for the rest of the country. And it's just wrong to take it away from New Hampshire. It's 100 years, the primary has been held here, and it's just wrong. It just struck me as wrong and very, very bad optics for our country.
Yes, so basically, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is saying that Joe Biden is rigging the presidential selection process. Oh, well, I say cynically, oh boy, the DNC is a private corporation, and it has great leeway in what it's doing, and it's going to ram its candidate right up your backside, which it did with Hillary Clinton. But then they tried in 2008, but she didn't succeed, did she? And then they tried. Let's not bring up Hillary. Let's go. The thing is that Joe Biden is picking South Carolina just as a ukase. Ukase is a word from the former Russia, where the czar would just say something, issue something, a command, and that was it. To hell with the legality. If you wanted diversity, which is the reason that Biden is giving for forcing the DNC to 86 New Hampshire as the first in the nation primary. You wouldn't go to South Carolina with 60 to 70% of the elected is one race, black. You would go to Michigan, which has a lot of black folk, white working class people who the Obama, Clinton, Biden Democratic Party could give a damn about, in my opinion. And you'd go to Michigan. You have unions, you have a lot of Hispanic people, you have a lot of Arabs. There's more diversity there, and it's a traditional democratic state. But no, he is rigging it because he is an SOB, and I wished I hadn't voted for him in the New Hampshire primary last time. Let's go on to clip number 2.
I'm going to talk about how I ended up here. But in the context of this polarization that's taking place, so I've spent a lot of my career, virtually all of my career, trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between Republicans and Democrats in this country. And when I knew I wanted to be an environmental attorney, but I also knew I didn't want to work for some of the conventional environmental groups, which were basically kind of in a bubble Democrats. And I wanted to really reach out to people, sort of hook and bullet people, and people who shared my values, but not my political party. People who understood. I think most Americans want a better lives for their children. They want to build communities that provide their children with the same opportunity for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us. There is no such thing as Republican children or Democratic children. We all want rich lives for our children. We want our country to be an exemplary nation. We want prosperity and safety. And there ought to be a way to talk about those issues to people who are not in my political party. So I started my career and spent 40 years working for a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen on the Hudson River. We have on the Hudson the oldest commercial fishery in North America. It's 300 years old. The fishermen, many of the people that I've represented for decades, come from families that have been fishing the Hudson continuously since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear fishery. They use the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam and then passed down through the generations. One of the enclaves of the commercial fishery on the Hudson is a little village called Crotonville, New York, which is 30 miles north of New York City on the east bank of the river. And the people who lived in Crotonville were not your prototypical affluent environmentalists. They were factory workers, carpenters, lathers, electricians. Half the people in Crotonville made their living, or at least some part of it, fishing or grabbing the Hudson. These were people who had little expectation that they'd ever go to Colorado or California or vacation with their families in the Rockies. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was their recreational values. It was their property values. It was their livelihoods and their food. In 1966, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton-Rockman rail yard. And the oil went up the river on the tides, and it blackened the beaches and made the shad taste of diesel. So they couldn't be sold at the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And all the people in Crotonville came together in the only public building in the town in a room almost exactly this size. It was the Parker Vale American Legion Hall. This was a very patriotic community. Crotonville had one of the highest enlistment rates in World War II of any community in our country, and one of the highest mortality rates. And almost all of the original founders, board members, and officers of Riverkeeper were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II, from Korea, from Vietnam. They got together in that room and they had been to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution. The Corps of Engineers, the Conservation Department, the Coast Guard, and they were given the bum's rush. They, after 20 separate visits to the Corps of Engineers office in Manhattan, two former Marines, combat veterans, Art Glauca and Richie Garrett, who were the founders of the organization, the Corps of Engineers, begging the Corps Colonel to do his job and shut down the Penn Central pipe. The Corps Colonel finally told them in exasperation, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, we can't treat them that way. Oh, by this evening, in March of 1966, virtually everybody in Crotonville had come to the conclusion that government was in cahoots with the polluters, that these agencies had become captured by the industries they were supposed to regulate, and they were functioning as sock puppets for those industries. And they felt that the only way that they could reclaim the Hudson for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. And somebody suggested that they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central pipe and burn up the pipe. Somebody else said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. Somebody else said that they should float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which at that time was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables.
Okay, folks, this is important. It's the RFK Jr. is a very, very successful and innovative environmental lawyer. And we're going to get into whistleblowing. As everybody knows, I'm close to the National Whistleblower Center where I did an internship. And this is how people can fight back, not with violence, but using the system itself. Let's roll the next clip.
And then a guy stood up who was another combat veteran from Korea, a guy called Robert Boyle, who was for 65 years the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated. He was a famous fly fisherman and spin fisherman. And 2 years earlier, he had written an article about angling in the Hudson for Sports Illustrated. And in researching that article, he came across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. And that law said that it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught. But also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And he took that law over to the libel lawyers at Time Inc., which owned Sports Illustrated, and he knew them. He said, is this still good law? And they said, it's still on the books, but it's never been enforced. And it was an 80-year-old law. And they said, well, you can still do it. And that evening, when all these men and women, 300 people in that American Legion Hall, were talking about violence, he stood up in front of them with a copy of that law, and he said, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law, we should be talking about enforcing it. And they resolved that evening they were going to start a group that was then called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association. Later became Riverkeeper, and they were going to go out, track down, and prosecute every polluter in the Hudson. 18 months later, they shut down the Penn Central pipe for good. They got to keep the first bounty in United States history under this 19th century statute. They got to keep $2,500, which is a huge amount of money in Crotonville in 1968. There were 2 weeks of wild celebration in the town. And they used the money that was left over to go after Stevagagi, Tuck Tape, Standard Grant, American Cyanamid, the biggest corporations in America, and winning their cases. In 1973, they won a case against Anaconda Wire and Cable. They got the biggest penalty against a corporate polluter in American history, $200,000. They got to keep as a bounty. They used the money to build a boat. They began patrolling the river. They hired in 1983, using bounty money, Their first full-time riverkeeper, a commercial fisherman named John Cronin, he hired me as the attorney for the group, their first attorney a year later. And I, during my time at Riverkeeper, brought over 300 successful lawsuits against Hudson River polluters. We forced polluters on the river to spend $3.5 billion remediating the Hudson.
Okay, folks, bounties. Just like a whistleblower gets a bounty. That was the False Claims Act of 1863 to crack down on fraud during the Civil War, the Abraham Lincoln Law, because people during wars steal money like there's no tomorrow. And that law was revived in the 80s by a Republican, Chuck Grassley. It's a strange thing, but Democrats don't seem to care for whistleblower laws that much, unless you get Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. But the citizens using the law. Let's roll with the next clip, because there's an important point to be made by you.
Today, it's an international model for ecosystem protection. This is a waterway that was, when I started working on it, was dead water 20 miles north of New York City, 20 miles south of Albany. It caught fire. It turned colors depending on what color they were painting the trucks at the GM plant, Terrytown. And today it's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. It's the last major river system left in the Atlantic Ocean that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson inspired the creation of river keepers all over the world. So we own the keeper name. We have 350 river keepers. Each one has a patrol boat. Each one as a full-time paid riverkeeper, and they litigate against polluters. It's a law enforcement organization. We are now the biggest water protection group in the world. A couple of things that I learned from them very quickly. One is that from my years of working for the waterkeepers, that this mantra that you hear oftentimes on TV or from politicians, big polluters, and we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other is not true. Good environmental policy 100% of the time is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the long term, over the generation, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the big polluters are asking us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy. And we can make a few people into billionaires by impoverishing the rest of us. And our children are going to pay for our joyride. And they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to mount over time and that they're never going to be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the cost of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. Today,
pollution is deficit spending. You know, I was born in 1959, and the Environmental Protection Agency was created by an act of Congress in 1970, signed into law by President Richard Nixon. And when I was telling Matt Connaughton once on a show, on I think his radio show, about 5 or 6 years ago, that I used to play at the Piscataqua River in the 60s in human feces, he was shocked. But they dumped human feces right into the Piscataqua River. Not the Piscataqua, that's down in Portsmouth, Piscataqua. And so, you know, there'd be feces, toilet paper. You couldn't eat the fish. There was a chicken rendering plant, a chicken slaughterhouse that would empty its stuff into the water. So the kids would jump off the trestle in front of the dam at the Kelly Falls and they'd come up glistening with chicken fat. That's what it was like back then. And as RFK Jr. was saying, the Hudson River had caught on fire. Not the only river to catch on fire, by the way. It was a corporate greed that just ate up all the resources and took a big dump on the rest of us.